Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth in the Nebo Company's webinar series, Smart Strategies for Talent Development. Our topic today is creating a culture of belonging. It will be presented by Kate Ebner with our special guest today, Kim DeBrew. To introduce myself, my name's Izzy Martins, and I will be your host for the webinar today. I am the Senior Manager of Client Experience at the Nebo Company. The Nebo Company is a leadership development firm located in Washington, D.C. and Atlanta. The Nebo Company works at the intersection of strategy, leadership development, and culture, providing facilitation, team coaching, and executive coaching to leaders. Today, we are delighted to share insights from almost 15 years of work with leaders. Before we begin, I want to give you a few basic instructions for how to interact with the webinar today. You'll have an opportunity at one point in today's webinar to participate in a poll. I'll let you know when this time has come. You'll see the poll appear on your screen, and please do vote when you see this happen. The other piece is we will ask you at the end to type in any questions that you have. Kate and Kim will save time at the end to answer your questions. You have two options. You can use the Q&A function in your Zoom window. You can also use the chat function. When your questions come in, we'll read them aloud to Kate and Kim, and we'll answer them. If you have a question at any point during the webinar, you're also free to type in your questions to us. The last piece is if you have any issues during the webinar, feel free to send me a direct email. My email address is imartins@nebocompany.com. With no further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speakers. Kate Ebner is the founder and CEO of the Nebo Company, as well as top leadership coach, facilitator, and founding director of Georgetown University's Institute for Transformational Leadership. Kate works with CEOs, senior leaders, and executive women. She is passionate about helping leaders and teams make their visions real. Kate is joined today by our special guest, Kim DeBrew. Kim DeBrew is a diversity, equity, and inclusion specialist, Nebo facilitator and coach, as well as principal consultant for Diversity Dimensions Consulting. Kim helps leaders explore new opportunities for addressing social equity issues in our society. She is passionate about promoting the success of women, racial and ethnic minorities, LGBTQI communities, and intersections of identity difference. With no further ado, Kate, I will pass it off to you.
Thank you very much, Izzy, and welcome everyone. We're so pleased that you've joined us today. We look forward to a great discussion with Kim and your questions, of course, at the end. I want to just start us off with a reference to this topic of creating a culture of belonging. And I'd like to share with you that I wrote a letter in our newsletter a few months ago, and it was really about this idea of belonging as the litmus test of whether you have a culture that goes beyond just including diverse people and perspectives, but actually creating an environment where people feel a sense of of belonging. This is my place. I belong here. I'm part of this. This has me in mind, you know. And so I said in my letter that I felt that this determination of whether or not you have a culture of belonging or not could be considered a litmus test of how you're doing in all of your efforts to recruit and develop and retain and ensure the success of a diverse workforce. So today, we're going to start off with a few quotes that Kim has put together for us. And Kim, would love to have you just talk us through these beautiful quotes and give us a sense of what they mean to you.
Sure. Thanks, Kate, and thanks, Izzy, for the warm welcome. I'm pleased to be with each of you today to share some thoughts about how leaders might step into the culture of belonging space in a more meaningful way. So the first quote is from Brené Brown. True belonging doesn't require you to change who you are. It requires you to be who you are. And to me, this quote is about courage, It's about being intact and being whole. And it raises for me the question of how might an environment or workplace adapt so that requiring you to be who you are is a condition of success? To your point, Kate, is a litmus test for your success. The second quote is just a beautiful image presented by Max Eastman about a smile being a visible cue of warmth and universal welcome. And the third quote is from one of my all-time favorite wise teachers, the late Dr. Maya Angelou, who says, "I long as every human being to be at home wherever I find myself." And this quote makes a big statement about human beings' need to belong and be at home. In fact, the social science literature really bears this out. The sense of social belonging is a basic human need, just like food and water. So as we dive into this conversation today, what I ask from each of you listening is to consider the subtle and not so subtle messages organizations send to individuals across the dimensions of difference about who belongs and about who doesn't, and about who can be at home being themselves. So Kate, how about I pitch to you for the opening question?
Great. I think that, Kim, you just did a great job of walking us into this. And when I think about where we want to start, I know that we're really developing this idea of a culture of belonging. And so I guess I'd like to really just start by asking you, to go a little bit further and explaining to us, what do you mean when you say a culture of belonging?
So the definitions that I draw from typically are provided here in the slide. The first is an environment where all constituents have the freedom to be themselves and to connect with others while contributing to our common future. And so what stands out for me in this definition are the terms freedom, connection, and contribution. And in combination with one another, they contribute to furthering the organization's goals. In Howard Ross's book, Our Search for Belonging, he describes belonging as a way to embrace a multiplicity of perspectives. He describes a shared identity, a shared destiny, a shared interdependence, shared values, and authenticity. So that notion of sharing where we're heading and accountability. The concept of what makes you, you becomes central to the organization as the organization pays attention to and is accountable for the experiences from persons from non-dominant groups. So when we think about what an organization typically does, what happens when we center those folks at the margins, when we draw them in and say, what makes you, you is linked to our collective success.
So Kim, we have a distinction to develop here, and that's really the distinction between inclusion and belonging. And, we've framed it here as inclusion versus belonging. I'm not sure that they need to be oppositional, but I think we want to give people a sense of why each of them is important and how they work together.
Yeah, I think you're right. I look at inclusion and belonging as points on the same continuum. Certainly, when you think about terminology, organizations may have had aims towards multiculturalism probably 20 years ago, and diversity maybe 15 years ago, 10 years ago, it was diversity, equity, inclusion, and now it's diversity, equity, inclusion, and belonging. And so I think what we see is a furtherance, a deeper distinction in those spaces. And when it comes to inclusion and belonging, I'll just draw these distinctions. A culture of inclusion ensures that when there's compositional diversity present, so what I mean by that is gender identity, race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, ability, generation, religion, the full expanse of difference that gets to be leveraged to create a high-performing organization. So safety is present, respect is present, engagement, a value of contribution, motivation. So all of those things contribute to that high performance of a team. Belonging adds one more critical aspect, in my view, and it is the first bullet: accountability. It adds that the organization, what I shared before about what is at the margins, becomes central to transforming the culture. So when we talk about belonging, we say, we can't be our best unless you're your best. Facets of belonging typically include acceptance, humility, a mindset of learning, interdependence, meaning we need one another, and investment, meaning I care about you and I'm invested in your success. And I have noticed as we look over time that organizations that have started to begin to leverage their compositional diversity. So they have a critical mass of either staff or leaders from diverse backgrounds present, that what they're really needing to transform the culture is some of the content that we're going to be exploring today. And I think if we look at some recent headlines, Kate, they really underscore that distinction in kind of a more expansive way. So here we have 4 quotes, just kind of grabbed from the headlines of either business journals or just sort of popular headlines in newspapers that give a quick scan as how issues show up in organizations. And if we look at the first one, all men are psyched about Goldman Sachs' relaxed dress code. For everyone else, it's complicated. And what stands out to me is men are named, so one gender is named. And it makes me wonder, what might a relaxed dress code mean, for example, for women? What might it mean if we look at intersections of difference? What might it mean for Black women or Latinx women for whom stereotypes and perceptions about professionalism may be in the way? And if we look at the phrase further about men, are we talking white men? Are we talking perhaps Black men? And how the notion of professionalism in terms of dress might be impacted by your identity group. The next 2 headlines, how microaggressions can affect workplace well-being in the workplace and why women of color get less support at work via research study, name the fact that just having diversity present doesn't mean there's a culture of belonging. Composition is present, and there may be factors, interpersonal dynamics that are in the way. And the question that we want to step into today is, what might leaders do to kind of ameliorate some of those factors, be aware of them, and engage in practices that really further what we're talking about when we talk about furthering a culture of belonging. So leaders today really require conscious commitment to being identity aware. When we think about what our defaults may have been, identity neutrality might have been what we named in the past. And when we think about identity neutral, it brings up the question, is it really neutral, or does the translation of neutral mean traditionally more white, traditionally more male, or related to the dominant culture? And I think what we're inviting you to think about today is, what might identity awareness open up in a leader's competency? How might leaders' awareness of identity difference and how organizations advantage some groups and disadvantage others get in the way of what we're aiming for in terms of a culture of belonging? Identity awareness is an aspect of emotional intelligence, which we consider as the baseline for all leadership.
Kim, can I ask a question here? I'm curious because when I think about your headline here, leading today requires a conscious commitment to becoming identity aware. I feel like that's a really clear instruction for leaders, that we need to understand that in the modern world, to be effective, we need to open our eyes and improve our ability to see who's with us and to see them through the lens of how they view their own identity versus, just sort of looking and sort of using a more stereotyped or a more, or even just a sort of what you're calling an identity neutral approach. So this idea of a competency around awareness about identity is the point I really want to underscore. I think this is a really great distinction, and perhaps something for those of us who work on either leading or developing leaders to really begin to tune into and become more educated and more savvy about this.
Yeah, I think you're spot on. One thing that I want to sort of encourage folks that are listening, whether they're responsible for leading organizations or just curious about the topic, or coaches, or other facilitators that work in this space, that this is doable. So I'm hoping that the message that we leave you with is, yes, the workplace is more complicated, right? As people show up with not single identities, but intersections of identities. So they are, what happens when you are a gay woman of color, right? From another country, right? There are intersections of identities. And to the extent that leaders are willing to step in, ask questions, be curious, and acknowledge that leaders, staffers, best stuff can be left on the table unless they feel fully welcome. It's worth paying attention and becoming more aware. So it's certainly worth the stretch goal into some of the waters of complexity.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's really helpful to us all to just even hear you bring this into language, because I think one of the things that often inhibits us is our ability to feel confident in the words that we use as we seek to get better. So I'm going to keep us going, and we want to do a little group poll for those of you who are tuned in to this webinar today. Want to invite you to comment on what is your biggest challenge when it comes to creating a culture of belonging. And I think Kim's done a great job of laying out what we mean by that. So Izzy's bringing up the poll. We want to launch it and invite you to just on your screen. Izzy, will you direct people on how to do this?
Sure. So right now you should see a poll has appeared on your screen, and we'd like you to vote on this question. And you have a few choices here. The first is difficulty recruiting leaders from diverse backgrounds. The next is live conflict, active instances of bias and microaggressions causing distress within your community. You may have retention issues, high turnover from particular groups. The next is not seeing people from diverse backgrounds around in your organization. The next one is not accessing the strengths, talents, and perspectives of our diverse workforce. Then we have current culture does not support authentic contributions from all. Then we get to community doesn't know how to bridge differences. And the final option is organization doesn't acknowledge lack of diversity and inclusion as an issue. So we see the votes coming through. It looks like we have votes from about half of you. If you'd like to take a moment and submit an answer, we'll give you just another minute to participate in this poll. Great. So if you haven't had the chance to vote already, I'll give you about 30 more seconds to send in your answer, and then I'll share these answers back for all of us to take a look at. All right. Thank you all for sending in your votes. Let's take a look. So as we look at the screen, we see that the option of current culture does not support authentic contributions from all is coming out as the #1 challenge that's arising. It's followed by not accessing the strengths, talents, and perspectives of our diverse workforce. And then we also see difficulty recruiting leaders from diverse backgrounds as another strong option, though it also seems that there is a decent spread of challenges throughout. So, Kim, as you think about what arose as this number one challenge, current culture does not support authentic contributions from all, what do you make of that? Is that something you commonly see?
I would say definitely. I think some of the research that I'm going to point to a little bit later supports this notion that there is a lot of talent, a lot of ability being just left on the table. Claude Steele describes it this way. He says that leaders of color spend a lot of time, in addition to learning new skills, describing new ways of thinking, or adding or trying to perform work in the workplace, you are also trying to slay the ghost in the room, the negative stereotype and its allegation about you and your group. You're multitasking because the stakes are high, survival and success versus failure in an area that's important to you. Multitasking is stressful and distracting. So if those are the things in the way, it's not surprising that leaders are struggling to bring their full authentic self into the workplace. And so we're going to talk a lot about competencies that really can hopefully create more space, and consider in combination with one another how workplaces can truly be transformed into places of belonging.
So thank you, Kim. And that leads us nicely into the 4 competencies that we're going to cover today. And, I want to zoom right in on the word competencies. Again, sort of what do we need to get good at? What do we need to develop competency in? And you've presented 4 important ideas here: cultivating emotional courage, creating space for authenticity, taking responsibility, and adopting equitable policies and practices. And I know you want to talk about each of them. So let's jump into the first.
Yeah, and I really want to say that leaders set the tone. So when we talk about competency in this context, what I want to invite us to think about is a lifelong learning journey. And each day, each way, gaining greater skill and effectiveness. So when leaders are able to bring their awareness to how isms, so racism, classism, ableism, all of the xenophobia, all of the phobias and how they manifest themselves into workplace culture and behaviors, conditions are right for all people to thrive, both individually and together. And so this conversation is going to be an invitation to notice anew, to engage anew, to learn, and to be part of the transformation in culture. All right, so emotional courage first. So Peter Bregman has a wonderful quote in his book with that same title. He starts this way: if you're willing to feel everything, you can do anything. So normalizing discomfort is the first invitation. So avoidance of discomfort is probably the most frequently cited reason for really not engaging in courageous conversations across identity difference. So feelings come up frequently, like I don't have the right words, as you said earlier, Kate, or I have guilt, I feel angry, I feel embarrassed, grief. They all can surface. And so normalizing discomfort may sound like a strange notion, and it's exactly what leaders need to consider to get comfortable with their discomfort in the face of difference. So imagine for a second you're a white leader trying to create a shared destiny with staff and other leaders across diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. What do you know about the lived experiences of members of those communities? How might you benefit from knowing more? Right? If we take Claude Steele's quote about all that's going on in the background, how might your work, how might your team benefit from understanding more fully the expanse of that person's experience. It's critical for leaders to accept those feelings as part of the learning process and not avoid them. Our second point, exercising humility. From the dominant cultural perspective, the workplace often affirms that everyone cares about what I think. Those messages come across in staff meetings and team meetings where the leader speaks and everyone else responds. It's the FedEx commercial where the gentleman, a younger colleague says, I think we should do this, that, and the other thing. And the leader repeats the same thing and the team hears it, right? So that affirms that the leader's voice, especially if it's a person from a dominant identity group, matters. And their voice may be amplified over the voices of others. So exercising humility invites the voices, narratives, and perspectives of others to be part of the dialogue. Fostering a curious mindset. So we're hardwired to make snap judgments without our awareness, attention, or control, right? We know commonly that is called implicit or unconscious bias. And it's important to stop, pause, and ask, why did I just think that thought? What perspectives am I not hearing? Whose voices are maybe present? What perspectives may matter here? Our final point in fostering or cultivating an emotional courage is about practicing 1 through 3. This quote is from Debbie Irving's Waking Up White and Finding Myself in the Story of Race. And she said about some work she wanted to engage in a community. I wanted to help. I came up with a plan. Interestingly, I did not spend a lot of time talking to the actual people in the actual neighborhoods because my belief system had already told me I had little to learn from the inferior people about their own circumstances. She's saying, I knew better. In hindsight, this was preposterous. I was trapped in my own paradigm, and I didn't know yet there was an incredibly different explanation for what I was seeing. So emotional courage is finding that new paradigm. It does get easier, always practicing and always serving as a beginner. So here are a couple of quick tips. So each of these modules could be their own topic. So I just want to encourage you that we're just doing sort of high-level concept and then a couple of practical tips. So tips for practicing emotional courage are first in the domain of listening and being present and curious for the person before you. The second is in the domain of humility and curiosity, acknowledging the other person's feelings and strengths, and asking questions with an aim of deepening understanding. And then the final tip is once you have listened and acknowledged and shown humility, then sharing your perspective with intention and with an intention towards connection. So our next competency, creating space for authenticity. I'm really glad that that came up in our comments and our interest in this topic. This is from work by Sylvia Ann Hewlett. And this was a study on professionals of color about their need to render their identities invisible, and it's the huge toll it can take. The study says suppressing one's authentic self can have dramatic consequences, including isolation, alienation, disengagement, with predictable effects on commitment and performance. So this is not only an effect on the individual, which is a huge issue, but it's also an effect on their performance and on their contribution to the organization. So if we know that belonging provides psychological and emotional security and allows people to be their authentic selves, then what talent, contributions, and insights and good thinking is being left out of the conversations that we're having in the workplace? What are the costs? What are the costs in terms of the relationships that we're having, the productivity, and to the climate? So it actually is a question that we might explore with you. It's important for leaders to uncover strategies for enhancing authenticity in the workplace, especially for folks from diverse identity groups. I think we have a question for you.
Yeah, we do. I think what we'd like you to do is to use your chat boxes, and we'll give you some instruction in case you need it, but go ahead. We'd love to hear your answers as participants in our webinar about this question. What do you think it means to create space for authenticity? You may have experiences of your own where you're consciously creating space and inviting authenticity, or you might have some ideas that are popping for you as you're listening to Kim speak today.
Sure. So everyone go ahead. You'll see in your Zoom window, you have the option to chat with us. You also have the option to send in a Q&A. So if you take a moment and think about this question and send in your best ideas and we'll read them out.
Some of you may find that the chat feature is in the button that says more, ... And when you go to more, you can find the chat. So the first one we have is from Heidi, and she says, make sure that processes aren't set up where it's the white males who get promoted without a process. It's discouraging to others when that happens, and it sends a signal that those non-dominant voices are not as valued.
We have another person, Mina, who says it means demonstrating or walking the walk as a leader and being willing to be vulnerable. That's a nice one. Mm-hmm. Angela says, I think it means to slow down. Oh, they're coming in quickly now. I think it means to slow down, and I find myself resisting that perhaps. Mm-hmm. Another person says you must always seek first to understand and invite participation from all involved. Someone else says we create space for authenticity in our office by giving the freedom to be yourself, freedom to express yourself without reservation or risk of kickback. That's a really important point. Jamie says it means setting aside time to be authentic and then practicing being authentic. That's another good point. It takes time, doesn't it? Kathy says spaces for sharing authentic stories of individual employees. This creates emotional fluency between and among each other as a team.
Mm-hmm. Miriam, thank you for acknowledge at the beginning of a meeting that you may call on those who typically are not heard, seen in larger gatherings. I think for those of us who are facilitators, this is a particularly important point. So thank you for that. Noticing whose voices are not being heard and calling on them. Creating a space for employees to feel empowered and sharing their contributions. Yeah, that's a really, when you think about that, that's a big idea. Creating a space for them to feel empowered. It's interesting to think about in your unique work situation, what that actually looks like. Could be different depending on where you are. Ask people what they need to fully engage in the workplace. There you go. Creating opportunities for stories, experiences, individualized social identities to be shared and heard. Again, takes time to do that. From Carol, recognizing from a strengths perspective all the diversity people bring and valuing all of this. It's so way beyond race or sex or country of origin. Neurodiversity is a good example of the diversities we don't always think of including. Being authentic as a leader and inviting and valuing each person's authentic self is key. Listening deeply is key. And Laura, reaching out to each individual and genuinely showing interest in knowing more how the individual feels and his or her potential is realized. You know, these are really great comments, and I think one thing that we've learned at Nebo is that when we go to do work around authenticity and presence, leadership presence, the word authenticity, which for some people seems like a great invitation toward being yourself, can feel like a flashing yellow danger zone for groups that feel less empowered and feel like being authentic must mean accommodating the dominant paradigm, not actually bringing your own authenticity. So we've become very tuned into how to think and talk about authenticity in a way that's truly inclusive. And I would just invite everyone to take a step back and think about some of the comments here, but the many ways that authenticity can appear are as varied as the human experience. So thank you for these great comments. I think we have a lot to consider.
Yeah, these are fantastic, and really looking for the authenticity, I think, is part of what I was hearing. So it's implicit in it, creating space, time and space, and looking for it. So with an intentionality. So this is a great quote that I often use in diversity and inclusion work, because the space between our intentions and impact can be vast, right? So we're judging ourselves. I'm trying really hard to make sure that all of the voices that are present, all of the dimensions of difference and perspective are present and are valued and respected. And the impact experienced by those diverse voices, perspectives, and experience might be quite different. So what we're inviting is to also, in this conversation, judge ourselves more deeply by the impact experienced by others, and to ask the question, all right, is your authentic voice present? And if not, how might we include it in a more impactful and substantial way? So we're going to shift to our third competency, which is taking responsibility. And to cue this up, we really want to start looking at what is our role. I love this image. We are in June, and this is Pride Month in many cities across the country. So we love that taking a stand with the rainbow flag is really where a culture of belonging begins. So there are a number of very effective, inclusive language guides available that really talk about the full expanse of language, people-centered language. So for example, if you're describing individuals with dimensions of ability difference, to describe the people first, a person with a disability rather than a disabled person. All kinds of ways that the language we use in the workplace can be more inclusive, right? A person of color rather than diverse people. In fact, I sort of moved away from using sort of diverse people and really naming those dimensions of difference more explicitly, because individuals may want to their identity difference to be named. I have some colleagues in the LGBTQI community who say when they read vision and mission statements, they go blah, 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 till it gets to LGBTQI. So really being comfortable with understanding what that language means is the first invitation. The second is opportunities to amplify voices. So whose voices? You said it so eloquently in our chat conversations, ways to make sure and be intentional about who speaks first and who speaks last and who never speaks. Kate quotes a statistic that says sometimes if you haven't spoken in the first, what is it, Kate, 17 minutes of a meeting, you may not speak. Mm-hmm. So really making sure that the experiences and the voices across difference are represented. And finally, calling in, calling out can be a very powerful tool for leaders. Identifying, calling in are the goal of an invitation to say behavior that was exhibited was harmful and to coach to a different outcome. Calling out is really holding individuals to usually a team standard and organizational standard, right? And they are aimed at addressing micro and macro aggressive behaviors. So when leaders take a stand for creating change, change happens. Okay, our final competency is about adopting equitable policies and practices. So typically, when I get calls for help to help an organization think through strategy, to really engage in culture change work in a more substantial way, it usually is how can we adopt our policies and practices to be more equitable and inclusive. And I hope that the stuff that we talked about already, which is about how the leader can change, is held up as equally important to the policies and practices. Of course, these support and complement the changes that happen internally for leaders. So I would not want to leave this competency discussion without them, but say that they are important but the policies and practices part of it is really complementary only when the leader has sort of stepped into greater self-awareness and greater learning themselves. So, okay, for teams, really recognizing that diverse and inclusive talent matters and that employees are treated with dignity and respect. Having definitions that the organization buys into and says explicitly about what's important. Not engaging in favoritism and segregated groups based on hierarchy and standing, right? So folks that have been there the longest, the folks that are in this senior most leadership ranks, really looking for opportunities to sort of normalize those baked in hierarchical structures so that a broader number of voices can be included. Actively engaging staff and leaders from diverse backgrounds in a variety of assignments based on strengths. I think we heard that in the chat discussion, and networks, and handling conflict in more productive ways. So taking advantage of the ways in which different groups handle conflict. There was a really great article that Kate and I discussed that came out in June on the bias of professionalism standards, and it was in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. And it talked about non-white and non-Western styles of dress, speech, and work styles really being a deterrent, perhaps, in moving forward practices related to a culture of belonging. And then for organizations, mission, values, strategic plans that are explicit, that name diversity, inclusion, equity, and now belonging as a commitment of the organization. Explicit non-discrimination policies. So spent a lot of time working in the association space, and whether or not meetings and conferences were held in cities and towns where there were non-discrimination policies in place became a big issue for consideration. Messaging, visual imagery, and communication that reflects a commitment to diverse individuals. So if somebody's looking to work in your organization, what do they see when they step into the lobby? What do they see when they look around? What's on the website? Is it the perfunctory, two folks of color laughing and smiling with one another, and then something very different when they actually show up for the interview? Mitigating the taxation levied for diverse communities to lead all diversity work of the organization. I want to definitely put a pin in this. So what if you're an organization that doesn't have very much diversity at the highest leadership ranks, right? So you've got one person, let's say one Gen Zer or Gen Xer or millennial, right? And they are charged with representing that entire generation on committees, right? We don't know much about social media, so you're on the social media committee, or you are being sort of charged with representing a complete generation. And so the invitation in this dialogue is to share that burden, is to make more central the role of being responsive to those diverse communities to an organization-wide commitment, to not just the individual commitment. And finally, regularly looking at demographic data, your metrics regarding performance review, climate surveys and studies, looking at when you disaggregate that data, what does it look like for diverse communities, and is the experience of the organization different across dimensions of difference?
Mm-hmm. Kim, I really love these 2 slides because they really point us in the direction of what should we be working on, what can we be doing. And I know we're tight on time right now, and I want to leave time for a question or two, but would you be okay with jumping to the closing thoughts so that we can get to a question or two?
Absolutely. So, I mean, what I want to leave you with is very difficult, of course, to undo hundreds of years of interpersonal racism, institutional racism, ageism, sexism, homophobia, ableism, classism, etc. And the invitation is to create an environment where individuals across difference feel fully accepted. And that change, that transformation, takes both the individual and collective commitment. The competencies we described today provide just an entry point. They're a beginning. They are an invitation to continued learning. And so I want to just thank you for being present, for these competencies. And I think, as Kate said, we'd like to hear from you, any questions you have or thoughts.
Yeah, that's great. And the 4 competencies, just to run quickly through them: the first, cultivating emotional courage; the second, creating space for authenticity; the third, taking responsibility; and the fourth, adopting equitable policies and practices. A bit of a roadmap, I think, for all of us around this topic. So let's take any questions people have. We can again use the Q&A box or the chat feature to pose a question for Kim.
So it looks like we have our first question. This question is, how do you see the promotion of affinity groups impacting the idea of inclusion and belonging in the workplace? And Kim, I'd like to throw that one to you.
Sure. So my view of affinity groups working really well are when they're undergirded by a structure that's already in place. So an organization that already has an explicit commitment, some of the things that we talked about already, that they are working at the recruitment, retention, advancement levels, that they're working at the communications levels, and that they are measuring over time the experiences of their communities of difference, and that they have ongoing learning programs. So all of those things, I think, are critically important for affinity groups to work best. Where I have seen them not work is when they are created almost as a replacement for some of the more structural commitments that organizations can make. So we are not sure what to do. So let's set up a Latinx group. Let's set up an African American group. Let's set up a LGBTQ group and talk amongst yourselves. Share your issues, support one another, and get back to us. Right. So my encouragement, I think they provide a wonderful opportunity for folks to be with one another, to create some safety, to sense of community, even in the workplace. So they provide a critically important component, and their anchor should be an organizational commitment.
Thank you, Kim. That's a great answer. Jim's asked if you all can use some of these slides, and I think our answer is absolutely. We'll be sharing them after the webinar with those of you who have signed on, and we would just ask that you attribute them to Nebo and to Kim DeBrew in particular.
Great. Thank you all. So we want to let you know that we have a few more webinars in the works in our Smart Strategies for Talent Development series. The first will be strategic coaching engagements and how to bring focus to coaching. That will take place on August 20th. The next is the magic and methods for choosing the right coach on October 29th. And then we have coaching across cultures on December 10th. And you may notice that these next 3 topics are really devoted to coaching in particular and diving deeply into how to sponsor and engage in great coaching engagements.
Yeah, that's wonderful, Izzy. These are going to be really good ones. And I think I'd like to just end with this slide that we jumped past, which says, ask the important question, right? What does success look like? At Nebo, we know that's a visioning question. So can you envision your organization with a culture of belonging? And what does that success look like? I think we can leave you with that question. But one of my favorite references that Kim often makes is that a culture of belonging, if we're successful, you look around and you see smiling faces, and that you can measure your success by evidence visible to you every day that this is a place where all kinds of human beings feel welcome. So thank you very much for joining us today and for being part of our process. These webinars are free, no strings attached, and we're glad to send the materials to you after the webinar. Thank you for joining us.
And thanks so much to Kim for joining us. And we hope you all have a wonderful day.